Good afternoon. This is,
Good afternoon.
thank you. Good afternoon, committee. We are the Senate Finance Committee. Today is Tuesday, January 17th, 2023. We are here with this dynamic committee for our first briefing. We're going to have an overview of alcoholic beverage regulation and medical cannabis implementation. And in the absence of seeing any questions or concerns, we will ask our first presenters to come forward. With the Maryland Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, we have Jeffrey Kelly, Executive Director, and Thomas Akras, thank you, Senator, who are going to come up. I'm sorry? Your constituent. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. That's a definite advantage. Good afternoon, gentlemen. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. Again, for the record, my name is Jeff Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, and happy to say I probably have one of the very best jobs in state government. I hate to say that publicly because it jeopardizes me, I think, but it's a terrific job, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this. We'd like to spend, and go ahead, Thomas, you just introduce yourself first, then we'll.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Thomas Akras, Director of the Legal and Legislative Division at the Alcohol Tobacco Commission.
Okay. And we'll spend just a few minutes to give you a sense of how alcohol works.
Let me get you to scoot just a little closer to the mic. Thanks so much.
Yeah, perfect. That's a lot better, sure, thank you. We're going to spend just a few minutes and give you kind of a primer in alcohol, tell you a little bit about who we are, and then a little primer on alcohol regulation in the state, and what we're kind of how we got here from pre-prohibition. I promise we won't spend too much time on all of that, but just to walk you through some of it. And what led to prohibition, honestly. And then again, we'll talk a little bit about tobacco products and then maybe some issues you'll be facing this session that are relevant toward alcohol and tobacco products. So, and I'll just put out a commercial for us now, and we'll put one out at the end as well. We try to be very helpful to you and to your constituents. If you need anything, you please contact us. Call me directly, call Tom directly. Jeff Hand's in the audience here with us as well. We aim to serve. We want to serve you. We want to serve your constituents and help you with any issues that you have. And we can be pretty effective at times. So thank you. Tom? Okay, as I mentioned, I already kind of covered this, and I will skip through some slides for the sake of this. Sometimes I tend to get ahead of myself, and we'll give away with the preview of what a slide is supposed to be about, and then we'll just skip through some of them. Some of them have a lot of detail in them, which I'll only introduce what they are, and then just leave it for you to look at later. You have copies of the presentation as well as the PowerPoint of the presentation. So if you wish, you can look at some of the details later. Tom? Okay, prior to being the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, we were an element of the Office of the Comptroller. We were the Field Enforcement Division. We had regulatory authority over alcohol, tobacco, motor fuel, slot machines, business licenses, and on the Eastern Shore, I say slot machines on the Eastern Shore, and every business that has a business license in some sense came through us, and we did tax fraud and ID theft investigations. In 2019, the Maryland General Assembly thought maybe it'd be better to remove some of the external influences on alcohol and tobacco regulation. These are very, very big industries. I've heard said before that the alcohol industry, from soup to nuts, from waitstaff to the manufacturers and everybody in between, is the second largest employer in the state after government. So it's a big industry that we're involved in. And tobacco is also one that has a lot of interest. And in that they can both products can be dangerous if abused and at different times, maybe warrant a different bit of regulation. So from that, the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission was created. We were going to take effect on July 1st in 2020, but COVID came along, and that just delayed a whole lot of things that were necessary to stand the agency up. So the General Assembly delayed opening or starting until January 1st, 2021. So we are just celebrating 2 years in operation. The separation was, we relied on each other. The Comptroller's Office, the remaining Field Enforcement Bureau, and AETC relied on each other for a while for a whole host of services, but over the last 2 years, we've grown rather significantly. We operate fairly independently. We receive a few resources from the Comptroller, a little bit of help with HR, with IT support, and with some procurement support. But we do most of that work ourselves. We package it up and we send it to them for their eventual pulling the proper lever or pushing the proper button. So. And, what we do, we regulate the lawful industry. We help enforce provisions of the law and statute for the legal industry. And we spend some time working in the illegal industry, which is rather significant. It might surprise you, but there's a considerable illegal industry surrounding especially tobacco products. We do a significant amount of interdiction work where we might go to Pennsylvania or Virginia, just across the lines, to stores that cater to our Maryland businesses. Why would they do it? In Maryland, a pack of cigarettes is taxed at $3.75. Each one has to have a stamp on it. In Virginia, each pack is taxed at 30 cents a stamp. So that's $3.45 difference for just traveling across a state line. So that's $34.50 per 10-pack carton. Now, when we're making seizures, we're not going after our neighbors who are going down to pick up a couple of cartons and saving dollars. As illegal as that might be, we have no interest in that, and that's not what we do. We go after people who make a living out of smuggling other tobacco products and cigarettes. So somebody who's going down to Virginia and is buying 900 cartons or so is who we're targeting, and they're making a ton of money. It's just a lot. With other tobacco products, our tax rate is 70% of the wholesale cost for cigars, not premium cigars, but your your machine-made, fairly routine cigars, 70%. It's 53% for all other tobacco products, things that aren't cigars or cigarettes and things like that. And it's 15% for premium cigars and pipe tobacco. So you think the 53% on other tobacco products and 70 cigars is pretty significant as well, where in Pennsylvania, the people who buy it in Pennsylvania and bring it to Maryland pay zero tax. So again, and these products aren't stamped. So that's a big part of what we do, is a lot of tobacco enforcement to stop this product from coming in or capture it. On the alcohol side, there's not so much in the diversion area. We do a lot of work to just make sure that it's safe product, that it's flowed through our three-tier system properly, that it's been taxed properly. It's a little bit easier in some ways to regulate than tobacco is. So I'm going to go over this in a little detail, and then I will skip over the next couple slides because we get into more details about these different positions. I'm going to go over it now while it's showing as an org chart. First, I wanted to draw your attention to, on the right-hand side off of the governor, you see the commissioners. The Alcohol Tobacco Commission is really comprised of two silos, the first one being the commissioners. These are 5 appointed people. They are confirmed by the Senate. It's the advice and confirmation of the Senate, but they are 5 individuals on staggered 4-year terms, and they do studies, they submit reports to the governor, they provide some advice or some guidance to the rest of the commission. The second silo is the Office of the Executive Director, which I currently am in, and that is the day-to-day functioning of the commission. That's where we issue licenses and permits, we conduct investigations, we do inspections. In instances where it's appropriate, we charge individuals for violations, or we enact some sort of an administrative process for violations of retailers or some of the wholesalers or manufacturers. And so let me just say, the Field Enforcement Bureau in this, or the Field Enforcement Division, rather, is, first of all, it's a division that has been created by the General Assembly. So it exists because you say so, right off the bat. And it's a really important division of what we do. The left side of that is the Enforcement Bureau. That is comprised of sworn police officers who do the inspection. They do the field work, doing all the field work. But the heart of what we do is the right side of that Administrative Services Bureau, which doesn't sound quite as exciting as anything else, but it is, we all support that bureau. They are the ones who issue the licenses, thousands of them, thousands of licenses and permits every year. They issue they register alcohol product that's coming into the state. They take care of the Beer Franchising Act and all of the information that comes in relative to beer franchising. They monitor something called the Credit Control List, which is something we have that is, it's a unique function in what we do. But they monitor and they administer the credit control function. They do the studies and the reports, quite frankly. They're the ones who staff the commission's work on studies and reports. It's this crew that does it. They do every important thing we do, and all the rest of us support their efforts. Tom. And then, while we're on this, I'll let Tom advance a couple, but I'm going to ask Tom to speak about what his division does.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good afternoon again. So the Legal and Legislative Division, through this division, we review all of the legal questions, not only statewide when we're talking about manufacturing distribution, but we also speak to a lot of the local jurisdictions in regards to laws that have been passed by the General Assembly and their effect locally. And just to give you context, prior to coming here, I used to serve as the Deputy Executive Secretary and General Counsel to the Liquor Board in Baltimore City. And that's important given the fact that we have 9,500 licensed establishments that serve alcohol in the state of Maryland. Out of those 9,500, about 816 are licensed by us, i.e. manufacturers or distributors. The rest are all retail establishments, ranging from your mom and pop packaged goods store to your stadium. We have in the state of Maryland approximately 5,500, and this is as of beginning of fiscal year 22. Those numbers may change in a couple of months when we get the new fiscal year 23 data, but we have approximately 5,500 establishments in the state of Maryland that sell tobacco products, cigarettes, OTP, ESDs. So when we're talking about what are the legal analysis that needs to be done with all the laws that are passed each year, there are a lot of questions. So we serve as a resource for the 25 jurisdictions that have questions in regards to the impact of legislation. I also, in our office, we also give advice to our law enforcement and our licensing folks in regards to how many licenses and who shall be issued licenses, licensing requirements, applications. We also provide general guidance to the industry in terms of how the alcoholic beverages laws and rules and regulations are interpreted. And this is key, particularly for our manufacturers and distributors, because they want to be in compliance too. And this is the great thing about the industry here in the state of Maryland, is that we work together to ensure compliance. We get questions all the time from manufacturers and distributors, and they ask us to come in to their shops and say, are we doing this right? And so part of what we do, or we visit, establishments, whether they be retail establishments, whether they be manufacturer distribution establishments, to ensure warm compliance. And when warm compliance doesn't work, it's my division that actually brings administrative hearings against and actions against manufacturers, distributors of alcohol and tobacco. I know the executive director mentioned Jeff Hand. He was a recent hire. He's the assistant director, and we've been able to create an administrative hearing process where we're now beginning to charge all of these cases: tobacco, sales to minors, enforcement for, again, manufacturers and distributors that go outside of the lines of compliance. So those are the things that we do in-house. Out-of-house, we also act as an advocate and liaison between the legislature, ourselves, in terms of explaining laws, providing support for other legislators when they ask us questions about how should we craft this or how should we craft that to make it in compliance with the alcoholic beverages article.
So I'll walk you through how the three-tier system works in Maryland, and I'm also just going to give you that little bit of an introduction into how we got here, because it's kind of fascinating. Pre-Prohibition. I'll just say, first of all, it started with beer. There were the European manufacturers of beer who were selling an awful lot of beer into the United States, and their goal in Chicago, there was a study done, their goal was to have one saloon that would serve about every 165 of age people who would consume beer, to have one saloon for that number of people. They got to somewhere around one for every 230 or so in Chicago. So you can imagine it was packed with saloons. Every corner had them. And there was a lot of demand on selling the beer that they got. So the deal was the brewer would say, sell my beer, only my beer. You may only sell what I produce, tied house. And in selling it, if you have about $100 or $200 and you agree to sell only my stuff, I'm going to set you up with a place. So they'd find a place for them, they'd buy the equipment for them, and the only thing you had to do was buy their beer and pay a little fee back to help, give them some of the money back of what their investment was. So you were absolutely locked in. And then they'd go and do it to the next person down the street as well. So now you have people who are really just a stone's throw from each other, obligated to the same brewer, which created fierce competition. And as a result of that, some of the crazy stuff it sounds like we do now or prohibit now in our laws or trade practices were based in a really good foundation. So as a result, they started offering free meals. Now, we prohibit that now because of what this caused. But they started offering free meals. Come to my place and drink, eat for free. Come to my place and drink, and we have gaming. We have prostitution. We have drugs. You come to my place, you're not going to want to go to the place down the street. So that's kind of how we got to this area of prohibition. Result was, people were on street corners, face down in the gutters, where we had just overconsumed, families were falling apart, and there was just really a lot of personal destruction that took place. So enter Prohibition. 18th Amendment was passed to ban alcohol. the federal government passed something called the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act was saying, the government essentially saying, on a federal level, this is illegal to possess or sell or transport alcohol. And then they left it up to each state to pass complementary legislation to further enforce the Volstead Act. Out of all the states that were states then, one chose not to pass any complementary legislation, only one. Any guesses who that would be? The Maryland Free State. We didn't pass any complementary legislation. So that's part of how we got our motto, the Free State. That's an element of it from what I'm told. There was a congressman in Georgia who was so incensed by us not passing any legislation that he said that Maryland should be cut out of the Union. We should not be a part of the United States. And there was an Evening Sun editor, I believe his name was Hamilton Owens, was so put off by that he wrote an editorial back saying we should be the Maryland Free State. We should never ban alcohol. We should secede from the nation, from the Union, before it ever be banned. And it never was banned in Maryland. He didn't publish it, but he ended up using it later on, releasing excerpts of it, and people had a good laugh about it. So then, we're in 1933 or so, the 21st Amendment passes, and now alcohol, it didn't turn out like everyone wanted it to be, and alcohol is now going to be a legal product again. The Rockefeller family commissioned a study by two authors and researchers named Fosdick and Scott, and they created this book. They wrote a book called Toward Liquor Control, and in that they kind of said, okay, here's what happened, here's why we went into Prohibition, here's why it needs to end. And they started getting into a lot of the things that we still hold on to today as regulation and trade practices. They said essentially, and primarily, what should happen, we're going to return all of the power back to the states, but the state should control the flow of alcohol. The state should be the seller of alcohol. They should have all the stores. It's what we call today a control state. We're not one of them, but that was the primary suggestion, be a control state, and there are 17 of them in the country. And they said, but if you're not going to be a control state, then you should be a licensing state, and that means you license, the state should license every tier of the alcohol system. And we look at it as 3 tiers. There's the manufacturers, there's the wholesalers or distributors, and there's the retailers. Tier 1 is manufacturer, Tier 3 is retailer. So that's our structure. I'm sorry. So that's our structure. So Maryland said, we're not going to do that either. We kind of objected to that. So we were one of the very few states in the country that isn't either licensing all of the tiers or controlling them all. We license the top 2 tiers. We license manufacturers, we license distributors. Each of the 25 jurisdictions that Tom was mentioning license retailers. That's very unique in the country that we do that. It's something we understand and we know. But it allowed local control over each jurisdiction to kind of be, relative to alcohol, what they wanted to be locally. Some wanted to be drier than others, some wanted to be damp, and some wanted to be fairly wet. And so that's what we ended up with. So jumping toward what our alcohol distribution system is today, it looks very simple. We have the 3 tiers, as I mentioned. If you're looking at the screen, the purplish are our manufacturers or suppliers. The blue is the second tier. They're the wholesalers or distributors. And the third are the retailers who sell to consumers. That's what it's supposed to look like. That's a standard 3-tier system. This is what we actually look like because we've just kind of created hybrid laws and hybrid licenses and permits along the way. So staying on Tier 1 on the left, the purple, the ones that are in purple are our traditional standard manufacturers. The one underneath them on that same left column that are blue are actually wholesalers who have certain importation privileges. And as a result of having that, they become the supplier. Example might be there's a wine in Europe that isn't brought into the country anywhere. One of these wholesalers has a connection. They get the wine brought into them, and now they become the supplier as well as the wholesaler of that product, but now they're also the supplier for that product. So that's an example. And our second tier, the light blue, are our traditional wholesalers that you think of, but in some instances, we let our lavender manufacturers become wholesalers. Examples of that might be our smaller production companies, our smaller brewers or wineries or distillers. We allow them to have some limited ability to wholesale. And also we allow our special unique licenses, vessels, aircraft, and airplanes, and trains to do some amount of wholesaling. Third tier is our retailers, but again, while we think it's very clearly a packaged goods store, a tavern, a restaurant, we also allow some of our manufacturers to retail. We allow people to go to the breweries or the distilleries or the wineries and consume on premise. So we think it's a very simple system, but it's actually much more complex than that. And this just gives you another sense. Go, Tom, you advanced. Thank you. That just gives you a sense that it's almost like there are ways for almost everybody to do almost everything here. There are some very fine separations that we work to keep track of, but it can be a little bit difficult. I'm not going to go through these, but there are like 9 manufacturing type licenses we issue. There are 8 wholesale type licenses, and then there are dozens and dozens of various permits or other smaller licenses that we issue. There are just a lot. All of these General Assembly created, and usually for some very unique reasons or purposes. And these are ones that we issue at the state level, but there are also several that can be smaller functions or privileges that the local jurisdictions allow as well. Jump into tobacco very quickly. So we have 4 different areas now that cover tobacco. They're all in the business reg section. Business reg 16 is about cigarettes. Cigarettes are very narrowly defined as tobacco or tobacco mixed with something that is surrounded by something other than tobacco. So if it was tobacco surrounded by a tobacco leaf, it's a cigar. If it's surrounded by anything else, it's a cigarette. And as I said, that's Business Regulation 16. Interesting, just one thing that comes up occasionally and concerns are people who open up packages of cigarettes for sale just on a countertop. It's illegal. The commercial law says you may not sell unpackaged cigarettes. They have to be packaged. If they're not packaged, they're loose, and we can enforce that activity. Business reg, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so we kind of talked about this, but cigarettes follow very much the same system as alcohol does. Manufacturers sell it to wholesalers. Wholesalers are the ones who apply the stamp, and we effectively, as a state, collect the tax when the stamps are purchased. The stamps are purchased from the comptroller. That's when the tax is paid. When they get put on the cigarettes, they have to be stamped, I think, within 48 hours of receiving them into the state. Is irrelevant because we've collected our tax dollars up front. Wholesalers can sell it to either sub-wholesalers or retailers and then to consumers. And this is relatively just an example of this system that's fairly simple. Okay, Business Reg 16.5 are other tobacco products. As I mentioned, generally speaking, other tobacco products are almost everything else tobacco-related that aren't cigarettes. It's snus, it's something you might chew, it is pipe tobacco and premium cigars. Even though they're taxed differently, they're other tobacco products, and that's commonly referred to as OTP. So it's a variety of things. A few years ago, the definition of OTP was so narrow that people were devising new products that we would all acknowledge were tobacco products, but they didn't fit the definition of OTP, so they weren't taxed and they weren't regulated. A couple of years ago, the General Assembly got together to fix that by giving us a sufficiently broad definition that allows not only for us to have captured what was out in the market, but going forward will likely allow us to capture new product as it comes out as well. So that was really a big help. Okay, Business Reg 16.7 addresses electronic smoking devices. They're kind of tricky. They don't have a typical excise tax. While they are defined as tobacco products, they are taxed at an elevated sales tax level. It's 12%. Generally speaking, there's one exception for it being as high as 60%, but generally they're 12% for these. Everybody nationally was behind the 8 ball. It took so long for the FDA to decide whether these were smoking devices or smoking cessation devices. They couldn't figure out if it was a tobacco product or to help you stop smoking. And it took years to figure that out. Meanwhile, the product is infiltrated into the system, and it was very difficult to wrangle in. We're starting to get a grasp on that, I think. The FDA still has a lot of work to do, though, for us. Lastly, in the business reg 16. I'm sorry, we can go and buy this. It's just a complex license. Lastly, in the business reg 16.9, it's a permit that you guys created, and this is first in the nation, so be proud of yourselves. You guys created this permit that allows out-of-state sellers of premium cigars and pipe tobacco to sell directly to consumers in the state. They could do that for years, but they did it without having to pay a penny in taxes, which meant it was really harmful to our in-house bricks and mortar sellers of these tobacco products, our tobacconists. And for years, they were trying to figure out a way to solve this puzzle. And you guys did it, quite frankly. First in the nation. There are several states that license or permit out-of-state tobacco sellers, like we've done. And they do that and require the collection and remission of sales tax. But through our legislation, not only do they do the sales tax, there's an excise tax on these tobacco products that our in-state people are paying, and now these out-of-state people are paying them as well. So they're figured out a way to have them pay the excise tax on the cigar, on the tobacco product, and the sales tax and remit that into the state. So far, there's only 7, but quite honestly, these are mega companies that make these sales into the state. So good job. That solved I'll say close to a decades-old problem for our Maryland tobacconists, and it's very much a level playing field. Now, these guys offer a huge variety, but they're not able to offer a huge savings now because they're not able to avoid the tax that our in-state people could have had to pay. And just one day, for grins and giggles, if you have time and you just want to do something fun, we're in the Treasury Building, and maybe it's not fun, but we're in the Treasury Building. Love to take you on a tour of our basement holding rooms. You might be impressed with the amount of stuff we have. They're filled with alcohol and tobacco products, all contraband or evidentiary products, and it's fun to show off every now and again. So if you think of the footprint of the Treasury Building, it's most of the front half of that basement footprint are our holding rooms where we keep this contraband product and evidence product. So if you ever feel like spending 15 minutes and walking through, be happy to take you. Good. Okay, and Tom's going to take over. No, you go ahead and do it. Yep, yeah, please.
So just as a recap, and this is actually forward-thinking as to some of the statewide alcohol, tobacco, and other cannabis-related issues that will be before the legislature in 2023. I want to point your attention first to the correction clarifications bill. Since the passage of House Bill 1052 in 2019, which created the ATC, there have been iterations every single year which transfer the powers and authorities of the comptroller to the Office of the Alcohol Tobacco Commission. So we saw in 2020 there were some, I believe there were some retirement personnel issues that needed to be addressed in 2020, and that passed in 2020. In 2021, there are also another retirement issue that presented itself to the legislature, and that bill was passed. In 2022, there was another bill passed that involved fire safe certification. This is to ensure that cigarettes burn properly, burn all the way and self-extinguish instead of just being allowed to burn. This is what we saw with a lot of house fires, and the legislature passed legislation, I think, 10 years ago dealing with that. So that has migrated now over to the Alcohol Tobacco Commission. This year, there's another corrective bill, which will, I believe, be the last big migration bill that we see. For instance, some of the permits that Jeff had mentioned earlier, they're still in the name of the comptroller. So transportation permits, storage permits, certain other licenses are in the name of the comptroller, although through the MOU, which is established between the comptroller's office and the Alcohol Tobacco Commission, we're able to issue those permits. But once this bill passes, all of those things will be addressed, and the power will be with the ATC to regulate and enforce the tobacco laws. So you will see throughout this legislation that there'll be removal of comptroller and executive director will be replaced. So you will see that throughout when this clarification bill comes through. A continuation of direct shipping and manufacturers for off-premise sales. If you recall, way back when the pandemic started, the governor issued an executive order which allowed for manufacturers of Maryland product, licensed manufacturers, to direct ship to consumers. This was then legislated to allow for direct shipping in 2021 to continue that. In 2022, it was extended until June 30th of this year, and we believe that this is another issue which will come before the legislature, where manufacturers may wish to extend the practice of direct shipping to Maryland consumers. Grocery chain stores, that's another issue that came before the legislature last year. We saw bills in Baltimore City, bills that would authorize in Baltimore, in Prince George's County, and I believe there was another bill which authorized throughout the state for grocery store / chain stores. Currently, that is prohibited. You can't issue a retail license to a grocery store, so that is an issue that will probably be before the legislature again. Third-party delivery and Uber delivery. We've heard of those apps, Drizzly apps, where you can hire a third party to deliver alcoholic beverages. This has been a cause of concern. A lot of state law currently requires that only employees of a licensed establishment can deliver alcoholic beverages, because there's a form that they have to fill out. They have to check your identification to make sure you're over 21. They need to check that you are the actual purchaser of the alcoholic beverages. So a lot local jurisdictions have certain requirements that these licensed establishments have to follow, and there has been a push by some third-party delivery systems to have non-employees deliver these alcoholic beverages. And there's a question as to liability and accountability in terms of dealing with this kind of delivery service. And then lastly, ready-to-drink cocktails. This was an issue before the legislature last year. There were bills introduced in the House and the Senate which would have reduced the tax rate for low-proof spirits. If you're familiar with ready-to-drink Jack Daniels in a can, those items are currently taxed Our state rate is $1.50 for spirits per gallon, 40 cents per gallon of wine. These are the excise taxes. And it's 9 cents for beer in the state of Maryland. They're pretty competitive tax rates. However, last year, we saw a bill introduced that would have taken the tax rate from $1.50 and lowered it to 40 cents for low-proof spirit tax rates. That bill did not pass, but there was a joint committee report request of the Alcohol Tobacco Commission to conduct a study looking at all of the other states to see how they tax low-proof spirits and what, if any, impact on their general revenues this caused in changing from a full-proof to a low-proof tax rate. So that's another issue that we'll see before the legislature, may see before the legislature this year. Just looking at tobacco-related issues, there was legislation that was introduced which, both at the local level and at the state level, which would have allowed local health departments to regulate and enforce tobacco in a similar fashion that is done at the state level. Those bills did not pass, but we think that those bills will come up again this year. There was also a zoning enforcement bill. This was in Prince George's County, and it dealt specifically with the clerk, limiting the clerk's ability to issue certain licenses, certain tobacco products-related licenses, where we're talking about cigarette retail dealers, OTP dealers, ESD dealers, or even tobacconist licenses within certain low distances from a church or a school or things of that nature. So we saw that bill, I believe, came through the House. It did not pass either. So those are just touching on the alcohol, tobacco-related issues. We also have the question of cannabis, and I think Executive Director Tilburg will go into a little bit more in depth about that matter. But the question for the ATC is, what is the role of the ATC? This past session, House Bill 837 was passed by the legislature, and it required the Alcohol Tobacco Commission and Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission to conduct a study. And it was really just a structural study of how our agencies would combine if they were to combine. That study was published in November. And it's in detail, it shows exactly how we would come together July 1st, 2023, to be able to transition easily into issuing licenses and issuing the alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis licenses on day one. Of course, there'll be a build-out in another 12 months or 18 months. What would we look like down the road in terms of combining our general administration and other facets of our operation, but I'll let Mr. Tilburg go into further detail about that. Also, how will we will distribute the product, how will we regulate the product, how will we inspect and enforce, and I think this is key because currently our agents, as Mr. Kelly talked about, when we go out and we issue citations, criminal citations, we will actually be able to seize product issuing criminal citations. We don't have to arrest and hold and do kind of the perp walk thing. So what we do is and a perfect example is what we did in Fells Point this past summer. There were individuals that had bars that they were operating outside of the back of their trunks, mixing alcoholic beverages and selling alcoholic beverages outside of their trunks. We didn't go in and arrest. We issued citations so we could collect the product, impound the product, test the product, and move forward with a criminal citation. And this is something that we think is applicable in the world of cannabis. If we see bricks and mortar shops that are popping up, we can issue a citation, we can collect the product, we can test the product, and go forward through a criminal citation, not necessarily through the whole criminal process as was done prior to. And then also advertising and things of value. That phrase, things of value, you see that a lot in the alcoholic beverages industry, particularly between wholesalers and retailers. As Mr. Kelly mentioned earlier, there are certain prohibitions in terms of the relationship between wholesalers and retailers. We don't want necessarily tied houses so that we see one product that is offered over all other products and the marketplace isn't fair. So we limit the things of value that a wholesaler can provide to a retailer to ensure that there is access to product equally by all consumers. So those are the things just to contemplate that work in the alcoholic beverages world that we see could be applied to the cannabis world. And I'll finish up with the last slide. Jeff, do you want to take this one about our
Yeah, just
contacts?
our first commercial and last will be call us. Here's, my name, Tom. Bill George is the fellow who runs our other major division, which is the Field Enforcement Division. Bill's not here today, but call us. We want to help. We think we can help you quite often, and we want to. And Tom, going over all those bills was to let you know what topics you might be facing, give you a little bit of history on them, not to say we were happy to explain consequences. We're not in the role right now of taking any positions on anything, but just want to explain consequences of these, if you care to hear from us about that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that thorough background and presentation. Senator Kramer has a question.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Good to see you both. Executive Director Kelly, I was just smiling when I heard you speak those words that you've got the best job in state government. And does that mean that this new Alcohol and Tobacco Commission has really worked out well, sir? Has it proven to be a good thing?
It has.
Good, perfect. Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that. If I recall correctly, one of the charges of the commission was that there was to be commentary on alcohol bills to, give the legislature an opportunity to see what the impact may be also from a public safety and health perspective. Has that begun yet? Is there any effort to fulfill that? My recollection is that
Right.
that stayed in.
That is one of our mandates, is to weigh in on alcohol bills and probably tobacco bills, I would think, too, to, as you mentioned, public safety and health, what some of the outcomes might be of any particular type of legislation. I don't know that that's on the synopsis we get yet from DLS when we're asked to weigh in on our fiscal notes and explanations, but we'll make a point of contacting DLS and see where we should plug that in, because they have a standard form they use, and it's not there, but it makes sense that we wouldn't. That is absolutely one of our mandates, and if I might, and I didn't mention this earlier, one of our other mandates is to provide training. We put out at least 12 a year advisories to the industry, to our fellow regulators and inspectors across the state of concerns, issues, trends, things we see, pitfalls, and how to avoid some of them, or further explaining kind of complex areas. So we've taken that part of our mission to heart as well, and we do regularly publish training and advisory things. And we also include local inspectors. We invite them, when we do our in-service training, we invite them to attend and train with us.
Good. No, I'm telling you, I know you have embraced the commission and your role, and you've been doing a great job with it, and I've had nothing but very positive feedback in that regard, so thank you for that. You touched a little bit on vape and vape products. That's an area where I had been actively involved along with some of the other alcohol and tobacco issues. With the feds being a little more aggressive in addressing the marketplace, do you feel that there is still room for improving opportunities to limit access to minors with vape products? Where do we stand on that? And I did serve on the Comptroller's Commission, or the study, whatever it was, that he had, the task force group. And I was just curious to get a better handle on where are we on that right now?
That stuff's really tricky, because we work very closely with the various departments of health, especially relating to tobacco usage of all sorts. And we get a lot of calls from them, and sometimes from not departments of health, but quite often when they're visiting and they see vape products, especially the flavored vape products, they let us know. But we have a very limited role in what we can do. So we go out immediately, we conduct a thorough inspection of the entire tobacco stock and operation with those vape products that are banned federally, but they're not banned by way of state. We advise them that they are in violation of federal law, that they probably shouldn't be selling these, and then we let them know that we're doing it, and then we notify our counterparts at FDA for follow-up. I can't tell you what kind of follow-up they do, because I suspect with the FDA, they just make a record of our allegations, and then occasionally they'll send out, I don't want to say they've done it in Maryland even, but occasionally what they'll do is follow up with smaller crews that they have that will make some of these inspections of their own.
Is it your thought that maybe enforcement would be more effective if we had state laws or regulations as well? And actually, can any of those regulations be implemented through your agency, or would it require legislative
I think
action?
it would require legislation to ban those particular products, and then we would put together any regulation that might be necessary to carry it out. But I think it starts with banning those flavored products, if that's where we're heading, and that would mirror that too. Yeah, please.
Senator Kramer, just, to add on to the enforcement piece, the representative from the Health Department, Dana Moncrief, we are in consistent conversations with her about federal enforcement. There are SINAR checks, which are federal checks to ensure that minors don't have access to tobacco products, and also local health departments receive monies to also do those checks. So early on this year, we met with Ms. Moncrief to ensure that we are coordinating strategies when it comes to enforcement. I won't go into the particular details, but we are working with the health department to identify problem actors and acting on them.
So am I to interpret that as leave well enough alone, or do we need to be more assertive at the legislative level on this issue?
I mean, if I would respond to, I'll respond to that, and I would say that we're working on an enforcement strategy right now. Can I get back to you after speaking with Ms. Moncrief about how they're doing and their thoughts on this matter before giving you a finite
With the
answer?
understanding that the bill draft deadline's this Friday?
Let me reach
Yeah,
out to
no,
Ms.
I'm
Moncrief
just-
and get back to you.
It's an important issue, and I know that we I haven't looked at recent statistics, a huge problem here in the state as well as across the country with minors having access to vape products, and that they were being marketed to, specifically by the industry, to pull them in. So I appreciate, if you could just share with me your impressions as to where we need to be going to
Sure.
address it. Madam Chair, I don't see anybody else's microphones lit up. Can I keep, well, it's Senator Hershey. I'm accustomed to sitting and watching him, so I have a couple more questions, if I may, take advantage of the opportunity. So thank you. I know at the inception of the legislation that created the ATC, the concept was that cannabis, when legalized, would be pulled into your offices. I have not seen the report that you referenced, so if you would please just follow up, I'd appreciate it. Because I know that was the original vision for when the commission was created, and to whether it would need to be broadened and include more commissioners, or exactly how it would happen, but.
Just to say, that particular report, though, that we were referencing is the structural combination of the Medical Cannabis Commission and the ATC becoming one unit. So it's
Right.
not necessarily adult use in everything that it could look like. It's just the medical element of the cannabis and the ATC. That's what this report references.
Oh, so that was not done with the intention of bringing medical into the ATC to account for recreational?
And it didn't account for recreational. But I think it was to get the ball rolling,
Okay.
quite honestly. Because this was part of a bill where in the uncodified language it said should, or I don't know if it was part of that bill, but it was married to a portion of uncodified language. It said, should the referendum on adult use pass, it is the intent of the General Assembly to have that Cannabis Commission and the adult use residing within the ATC.
Correct.
So the intent is stated, but there was no policy to work off of, knowing how many licenses and that sort of a thing. But it did mandate that we start to figure out how to combine existing resources.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Last question about an issue that, again, relates to cannabis. We do currently have in regs a prohibition on packaging that would entice minors. Can't look like, candy or cereal or whatever it may be. However, there's a huge marketplace selling wrappers, empty bags, that we have not addressed in our regs. You can go to it right now and Google cannabis packaging. And it's all, the takeoff on the various kids' candies and things like that. So that's how there's kind of a loophole at the moment in the marketplace. Are you coming across that being an issue? And I know there's a lot of discussion about prohibiting that marketplace of the empty bags. So, right now, when we do have retailers, they're not going to be able to package it to look like gummy bears. But there's a huge marketplace out there selling the empty bags so that Marylanders can buy those empty bags, repackage them into things that are appealing to minors and then sell them. Are you coming across that at all? And
No, Senator, I can't say we are, but I would hope that any consideration of legislation would include the packaging mandates and would give the ATC or the Cannabis Commission, whoever is going to be regulating that, quite frankly, authority over the packaging, requiring packaging and label approval.
Right.
I think that would be key to
Okay.
us having that.
Perfect. Madam Chair, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Senator. Senator Hershey, thank you for your patience. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few questions on the tax structure, because it's a little bit different than obviously just the sales tax, right? So we have, on tobacco, we have the stamping tax, or is that considered an excise tax?
Yes, sir. It's the excise tax of $3.75 per pack. And then on top of that, when the ultimate sale is made, there's a 6% sales tax.
Right, so it has both an excise tax and a sales tax. So
Yes, Senator.
is that all tobacco products?
That's cigarettes.
Cigarettes was a 340, right? Or
It's
380?
375.
375. Okay, but do all tobacco products have both the excise tax and the sales tax?
That's a good question. No.
Okay.
Only to this extent. Almost all other tobacco products have a tax. It's not the $3.75. It varies depending on the type of other tobacco product it is.
Right.
But they, and the ESDs, the electronic smoking devices, which are tobacco products, but they're cut out of the OTP tax structure, has a rate of 12%, or a sales tax of 12%.
Right.
Except that if it's a 5 milliliter or less cartridge of juice, essentially, that's 60%. Other tobacco products, the mass of other tobacco products is 53% of the wholesale cost, except the mass-produced cigars are 70% of wholesale cost, and 15% for the premium cigars and pipe tobacco. And those are all excise taxes upon which the eventual sales tax is included.
Included with that, okay. Now,
Is added on to, I should say, is added on to that.
added on, right. So of these taxes, and we'll just call one the excise tax and one the sales tax, are they dedicated to specific funds? So are some of them general funds and some of them special funds?
I don't know, Senator. I mean, I don't deal with the tax side of it, on the
Okay.
tax collection side, or that rests with the Revenue Administration Division and the Office of the Comptroller, so I'm really not sure just how they're
They're
divvied
not
up.
dedicated, and part of why I'm asking these questions is obviously we're going to be dealing with the cannabis legislation, so we're talking about
Right.
how we're going to set up that tax structure. So I was just wondering, is any of the tax revenue coming in being dedicated to going towards mental health issues or regular health issues or anything like that? They're not pointed to say through that, the same way they're not pointed to go into education or anything like that, right?
I can't tell you, we'll certainly look into it. I
Okay.
can't tell you with certainty, but I feel like there are some elements of it that were directed to
like-
special fundings.
Right.
But I just don't know enough
I
to.
kind of thought there might have been too. Okay, and then alcohol beverages, the same thing. Everything does have some type of excise tax and the additional sales tax.
Yes, sir.
And that's
Excise-
9%.
That's correct, exactly, on top of the cost and the excise tax already applied.
Okay, okay. And again, we don't know if those are dedicated to go any specific
I don't know that they are.
funding source. Okay. Finally, into a little bit different than what my colleague asked about advertising in cannabis. I know where he was going through. But are there regulations currently about advertising tobacco products? Restrictions on that? We don't seem to see advertisements for cigarettes on
There are,
television.
I believe
anymore.
there are some federal restrictions on those advertisements, on billboards and mass market publications or.
Right.
Yeah, I believe those exist at a federal level. So our regulations are not so much to prohibit advertising, but to demonstrate how you may do it. And it's, as an example, it's more to cover at a bar if they're going to have Friday night special, Friday night happy hour, and they want to advertise that. There are rules on how much space they're allowed to dedicate to that, what else must be on that sign, how personalized may it be, who's allowed to pay for it or help provide the sign. So there are a lot of rules relative to that, but not so much just about advertising of the entity itself,
Correct.
of the products themselves.
And that first example is going to be probably more on the alcohol side, right? I mean, advertising for alcohol products at a bar, rather than advertising for cigarettes or other tobacco products.
Correct.
And so I think you're right. I think there is some type of federal restriction on this, but Maryland hasn't adopted anything specifically related to advertising on tobacco products.
Senator, I don't think so. And in the world that we live in, which are the business regs relative to tobacco,
Right.
I don't recall there being anything on that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Senator, if I may add, there are local jurisdictions, particularly in Baltimore City, which will pass their own ordinances in terms of how close packaging, for instance, can be to the front of a counter or something like that within arm's reach of a
Right.
minor. So there are local jurisdictions that do have some, I wouldn't necessarily say direct advertising, but indirect advertising requirements or
Right,
restrictions.
Right, okay, and that's more product placement within a broader facility that happens to sell those products.
Correct.
So if I was looking more at a dispensary, that's not necessarily relevant, but I understand what you're saying there, right with that. So, okay. All right, thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, directors, for this very informative briefing. I have several questions in different areas. So I want to pick up with Senator Hershey when you talk about the sales tax and excise tax. So for most of my constituents, a tax is a tax, right? And of course, the consumer end up paying whatever you call it. So could you summarize again, what's the difference between a sales tax and an excise tax? You were saying one is a percentage, one is a fixed dollar amount?
Now, that's a great question. An excise tax is a tax that's affixed to a particular type of product in advance of its retail sale. So the advertised price for sale at retail includes the excise tax, but doesn't specify the excise tax. I think maybe the only exception to that might be motor fuel. I think we put we put on the pumps the taxes you pay on motor fuel, but for alcohol and tobacco, the price of the product is excise tax included, not sales tax included, but you as a consumer don't ever see that. You don't know what element of that price is excise tax.
So with the excise tax, the manufacturer would charge that to the distributor in terms of,
Mostly, yeah, you're asking great questions. So in the case of beer, the manufacturer has to pay the excise tax before beer enters the state of Maryland.
Okay.
So it's 9 cents a gallon, and let's say Anheuser-Busch or Coors or Miller, any of those manufacturers make their beer, they want to ship it into Maryland, they're going to send us their 9 cents a gallon tax first. But in the case of spirits and wine, they can send that into Maryland to a wholesaler where it sits untaxed, no excise tax. And they pay the excise tax on what they call upon depletion. So it's when the retailer makes an order, then the wholesaler applies the tax. The nice thing about both of those systems is, from a state tax collection standpoint, we only have to go to a limited number of people, either the manufacturer for beer or the wholesaler for the excise taxes. That's where the bottleneck is to pay the tax. So beer before it comes into the state, and wine and spirits as it leaves a wholesaler and goes to a retailer. That's for alcohol. For tobacco, it's the stamp. They buy rolls of 30,000 stamps at a time. The stamping, our wholesalers do. They pay the whole tax up front. They get a small percentage off for servicing for us, for applying the stamp, for collecting theoretically. So they get a small percentage off of that $3.75. But they pay the $3.75, buy their roll of stamps, and then as they need it, stamp cigarettes for sale into Maryland. So that takes place at the wholesale level. Other tobacco products is a little more tricky. It depends on a variety of things. If you're a tobacconist, which is a retailer, but you are like 70% sales of tobacco products, then you may buy not cigarettes, because the cigarettes are always going to come stamped, but you may buy your other tobacco products tax-free. But your next reporting period, whether you sell any of them or not, your next reporting period, you have to remit to the state the tax, the appropriate percentage, depending on the type you bought, to the state. But if you're a retailer, not a tobacconist, but just a traditional retailer, so think 7-Eleven selling cigarettes, they sell a lot of other things in addition to tobacco. Cigarettes isn't a good example there, but they sell cigars. They buy their product tax paid. In Maryland, other tobacco products, cigarettes and other tobacco products come from the manufacturer to the wholesaler to the retailer. The exception is the tobacconist may purchase directly from a wholesaler, may purchase directly from a manufacturer, certain products, tax-free, but then have to pay the tax once they receive it in their next reporting period.
Yeah, thank you, Director. So could I ask you a favor to give me a flow chart with all the different?
I think I got it.
Yeah, and
Sure,
could you-
sure.
Yeah, do that for us.
Absolutely.
And so thanks, appreciate that, because there's a lot of intricacies there.
You bet.
So let me go a little backwards. So you mentioned, I think with establishment with alcohol, that might have a violation, you give a criminal citation. So I've learned in Annapolis, when you put two words together, it might have a different meaning than you would assume. So, and you said criminal citation doesn't result in any arrest, but could you explain what a criminal citation is? Felony, misdemeanor, years, how do you go after the folks in court?
And I think Tom had mentioned that, and what he was referring to is, in that instance, is when we have somebody who doesn't have a business, and you're waiting in line at a particular fun place to get into a liquor establishment, and the line's so long, somebody comes along with a cooler and decides to set up shop and hydrate you while you're waiting in line, which they can't do. They don't have a license to do it. So what we are able to do right off the bat is say, you are not licensed, so you don't have an alcohol license, you don't have a sales and use tax license, and here's typically what we would do. You don't have a sales and use tax permit, you don't have a business license. We are going to cite you on a criminal citation for a business license violation, which is very effective. I think it's a $300 fine and 30 days or 90 days in jail. We write thousands of criminal citations over the years. Nobody goes to jail for these things. Most of the time, they don't even get convicted as long as they clean everything up in advance.
But they have to pay.
But it lets us seize the contraband product. That's what it does. It lets us get that contraband product off the street at that moment. So there might be a financial impact to the cost of the person who paid for the product and now doesn't have it. But it lets us take that contraband product, which nobody can guarantee the safety of anyway. So we take that. That's in the case where you have somebody who's really selling outside of an establishment. When it's an establishment in violation, sure enough, when they make violation, there's probably a violation of state law, but equally important and maybe even more impactful is the violation against the regulations and the law on how they distribute alcohol. So we don't write a criminal citation or a civil citation for them. We write a report. And because it's the local licensing boards that license them, we submit our report to the local licensing board. The local licensing board decides to have a hearing or not. And if they do, we simply become a witness to that. We present our case, what we saw, and the local licensing board decides if it probably happened, if it did happen and they're convinced, maybe they'll issue us a warning, maybe there'll be a suspension or a fine. Or they may just say, we're not convinced that this happened and we're just gonna let it go at that. So when it's an establishment otherwise licensed, but it's a violation of regulation, how they operate, local board, when they're not licensed at all, we issue the criminal citation.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned confiscated products several times. So the question is, what do you do with all that confiscated stuff when you're done?
That's our basement. That's why I say you gotta come see it. It's really cool.
No, I mean, do you?
How do we dispose of
Do
it?
you get it back in? to the system?
Okay, so when we confiscate, people are issued a receipt for what we confiscate, and they're given provisions on how to apply for a hearing, which come in Tom's shop, to get their product back if they want to do it. So that's one thing that they're eligible to do. Otherwise, unless now that's when it's contraband. That's when you may question that it's not tax paid or something. If it's evidence, it's evidence. And we hold on to it until the case is adjudicated. And then after the appropriate appeals period and whatnot, it's generally marked for destruction or disposition in some sense. If it's evidentiary. If it's contraband, we offer the opportunity for somebody to come in and have a hearing to maybe get the product back or make their case. And if they don't get it back after some period of time, the case is disposed of, and so is the product. Oftentimes destroyed, depending on the type of product, but oftentimes destroyed.
So if it's like cigarettes or any alcohol that is, of course, not contaminated, you don't really auction it off to
No,
the
you're asking great
highest bidder,
questions.
or?
We kind of do. In the case of alcohol, with beer, we don't, because beer has born on or freshness dates or whatever, and the period of time that we hold the stuff, oftentimes, it takes longer to adjudicate the case, and those become out of date or out of code. So we destroy beer generally. With spirits and wine, if they're sealed containers, we package them up into lots, we advertise that we have these lots and license people who have existing licenses. They're going to come in, examine them, and offer bids. So it's a sealed bid process, and we do make some sales in that manner.
Yeah, thank you. Madam Chair, one last quick question, please. So, may I? Okay, thank you. So you mentioned on the Maryland actual alcohol beverage distribution system, the 3 tiers. It's curious, you talked about like vessels, railroad, airplanes. They could be in tier 1 and 2. So they could be supplier and distributor? I'm not
The way they
sure.
get, they don't get to supply or distribute so much, except to themselves, but they can purchase directly from a manufacturer and don't necessarily have to go through a wholesaler to make the purchase. So they can, airlines could, trains
Airlines.
and vessels could buy directly from a manufacturer, which would allow them to not have to go through the traditional wholesale
Yeah,
operation.
So why does that exception allow for those transportation issues?
Well, I don't know the history of it. I have to say, I do know the history of a lot of it. I don't know the history of that in particular. And with a lot of it, there was probably an issue at one point which made them not eligible to do it. I don't know if it's, I just don't know if it, I really don't know. I couldn't tell you. I don't know if it's, I know we have cruise ships coming into Baltimore, and sometimes they're difficult. It's difficult to work after them because there's not necessarily a carve-out for them. So they have to go through some additional exercise to get the product on board that they need to get on board, and this maybe just makes it a little bit easier for these other types of conveyances. I don't know the history on that one.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for your patience.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Reedy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is really informative and interesting for those of us that have never done alcohol policy directly in committee. It's going to be a learning experience, but it's very helpful. I had one question about the criminal citation you talked about versus the citation. I thought it was really smart that you talked about when you dealt with the issue in Fells Point. You're not going in and perp walking people because that's a potential for, you're putting your folks in a bad situation. You're also, we're not trying to necessarily fully criminalize people who are just trying to make a buck even if they're doing it the wrong way. So I think that's smart. What is the difference between just you give them a citation and then you pursue a criminal citation? Can you explain what's in a criminal citation and what the punishment is? Okay.
Yeah, it's the criminal citation is the citation. It just means instead of somebody being arrested, fingerprinted, booked, going to a commissioner for disposition at that point, it's like getting a traffic ticket. You're just getting a citation that says, you've been we're charging you with, really in this case, conducting business without a business license.
It's generally
There's a
a fine.
$300, I believe it's $300 and 90 days in jail, and again.
And they're losing all the material
But
you
you
seized
lose the
from them.
material, and
Yeah,
that's,
okay.
that's really our hook. If we take the material and we take it back to a lab that we participate in through the comptroller's office in Jessup, and we have it tested at times to see if there's alcohol in it, because sometimes it's fruit that's been infused with alcohol, or it's in little bottles that might look like little plastic or glass iced tea bottles, but they're not. They're alcohol. There is a danger to that. There is a danger to letting people rectify that product outside of controlled, but then in any event, when we would see something like that we can't identify as a commercial product, we take it to the lab. If there's alcohol in it, then we may pursue charges for selling alcohol without a license. And if we do that, that's through an application to a district court commissioner, and that would be the way it gets introduced.
But so that's good. So, but even in that case, you're not usually getting a criminal, or that could lead to a criminal record if you're found to be doing it without a license.
It could.
Okay. But again, that's not our first, that's actually good. So it's a way to really crack down on it. I was just curious if there was a different citation, but criminal citation is criminal citation.
Exactly.
Got
It's
it.
used for many, it's the platform for many, many things short of having to make an arrest or do something along
Right,
those
got you,
lines.
okay. Yeah.
Senator, just follow up with that. A lot of times during adjudication, as the executive director said, these cases are steaded or null pros, but as a condition of that stead or null pros, the property is forfeited.
Right,
So
gotcha.
at the end of the day, it's ensuring that that property that would create and allow for illicit market doesn't ever hit the market.
Right, and then if they're caught doing it again, they would be more opportunity for further criminal penalties, but you're giving people a good stern warning and a penalty without it being a criminal record.
Correct.
Okay. And we foresee doing this, you talked about in the marijuana space, because that's obviously going to be of interest to all of us as we look at that issue.
Something to contemplate for the legislature.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I don't see any additional questions for this panel. Thank you both so very much for your information. I'll be in touch with my questions offline. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Members, we're going to turn to our overview of the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission. We have Executive Director Will Tilburg here. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. You want me to just?
Yeah, I think you can get started.
Okay.
We have a copy of the,
Okay.
is this the presentation
Yes.
that's going to come up
Yeah,
on
it
the
is.
screen? Sure, you can proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Again, Will Tilburg, the Executive Director for the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, here today to provide an overview of the state's program, MMCC's role, and where we currently stand with our medical cannabis program, and a few slides at the end about what has already been adopted by this body related to adult use, requiring certain reports, including the transition of our personnel to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission in the future. I'm going to start at the beginning of this program, of our medical cannabis program. It does not go back to the 1930s. I could start with the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, but I think for everyone's benefit, I'll just skip forward to 2014. How do I? Yeah, it's not. What'd you do to the keyboard, Tom?
Go back to the 30s now?
Yeah. So again, MMCC structure, our role, what our authority is, what the medical program looks like, some statistics today for patients, businesses, economic metrics, and then again, looking forward to the future. So for background, we are an independent commission within the Maryland Department of Health. It was established in 2014. Our mission and statute is to provide a safe, effective, and consumer-friendly medical cannabis program. Currently, we have a body that is 13 volunteer commissioners. That's not the original iteration. Originally, there were 16 commissioners in 2014. In 2017, Governor Hogan reconstituted the commission, so brought on 16 new members. And then in 2019, the General Assembly reconstituted the commission again, reducing the number to 13 and requiring that 3 of the positions be selected by a list provided by the Senate President and the Speaker of the House. One of the members is also either the Health Secretary or a designee. So how has that changed the makeup of the body over the years? Initially, it was heavily legal and law enforcement. So we had state's attorneys, there were Sheriff's Association. It was largely, again, a law enforcement, criminal, legal body that was made. The transition to 13 members, it's now primarily medical and healthcare focused. So of our current membership, and we actually only have 11 of the 13 positions currently filled, it's 7 healthcare professionals, mostly doctors, including our chair, Dr. Obi Onyewu. We have 1 scientific researcher, 1 agricultural expert, 1 business financial expert, and 1 patient advocate. In addition, the body has become significantly more diverse over the last several years. 8 of 11 of the existing members are women or minority, and 5 out of the 11 are black. So it's been a significant change as the state's focus, as the General Assembly's focus, has been on increasing equity and diversity within the program. The body itself has come to reflect that. We also see on this page, below the commission membership are the 77 full-time staff members. Of those, 46 are contractual or temporary. That means that they don't get paid vacation, they don't get health benefits. It is extremely difficult to attract and retain talent when not able to provide these sorts of benefits to staff. So only 31 out of the 77 are in merit positions. That's a little less than 40% of the overall staff. We are 100% specially funded. The funds come from licensing fees levied against the growers, processors, and dispensaries in the state. Our 21 budget was $8.7 million. The 22 budget was largely similar to that. Can you go next? Our role, the major roles here are listed on this slide, so there's 5. First, licensing the growers, processors, dispensaries, as well as registering the patients, providers, and caregivers that participate within the system. We inspect the businesses that are licensed and regulated by the commission, and we hold administrative hearings and levy penalties for those that violate either the statutes that you all have adopted or the regulations that we have implemented, further implementing the statutory provisions. We also troubleshoot any patient registration and access issues and promulgate and implement programmatic regulations governing the licensed businesses, registered businesses, and registered patients and providers. In terms of the landscape today, what's been authorized either in statute or regulation for number of businesses, there are 22 growers authorized, 28 processors, and 101 dispensaries. There are also ancillary businesses in the space, so that can be secure transport, waste disposal, independent testing labs, and delivery. Those are not capped. We have about 50 of those operating currently within the state. Of those, again, one is laboratory testing. We have 5 ITLs that are registered or accredited and conduct testing on all of the products that enter the marketplace in the state of Maryland. Almost as important as what we do is what we do not do, and it sort of dovetails off of the conversation that was had at the end of the presentation on alcohol and tobacco. MMCC has no authority over use, possession, and distribution of illicit cannabis. That remains solely within the purview of state and local law enforcement. So since the referendum passed, our office has received several calls. There's a pop-up dispensary in Baltimore City. We don't have sworn law enforcement officers in our office. We do not have criminal law enforcement authority, and there's nothing that MMCC or its staff can do about unlicensed or illicit activity. Similarly, with the providers that we register, we don't have any oversight over their practices. So the licensing boards, the Board of Physicians, nurses, dental examiners, retain primacy. So if we believe that someone is issuing written certifications without doing in-person assessments and the like, we can refer them to the boards, but we don't actually have authority over those individuals. In fact, we're prohibited in statute from establishing any additional restrictions on providers in this space. Our governing structure, can go through this quickly. We have 5 standing committees that cover all of the functions that the commission provides. So compliance, overseeing the administrative hearings and levying of penalties, the executive that oversees mandated reports and serves in an emergency capacity between meetings. Full commission meets generally once a month. There's finance and budget that approves our budget, and policy that considers, proposes, and adopts rules that govern the program, and research and education that oversees any research activities in the state and develops educational materials on safe use, storage, et cetera, of medical cannabis. Go to the next slide. And that slide did not come through. That goes over our general structure and its relationship to the industry itself. The only thing that I would note here, I said that there's a facet of it that there's public facing that is helping with technical assistance for patients and providers and others that may be having difficulty. And we receive at present between 500 and 1,000 calls from patients, providers, et cetera, each week with questions about the program, how to sign up, troubleshooting the application process, issues with a particular dispensary or provider. And so we assist in that. And we also process about 100 applications per day from individuals. And the current patient population that is registered with us and certified by a provider is 163,000. But the commission itself has approved for registration about 230,000 individuals. So there are 70,000 people that are registered as patients, but either dropped off of the rolls because they did not renew a certification, in many cases because it was the use of cannabis was related to a surgery or something else that was a moment in time and they did not need it on an ongoing basis, or some folks register but end up not actually going forward and seeing a provider. So that patient registration process, as I alluded to, it is a 2-step process. The first thing you do is go to our website and register. That's simply just demonstrating that someone does live in Maryland, that they are over the age of 18, then they can be registered with the program. That does not grant them access to a dispensary or to medical cannabis. In order to do that, you have to see a certifying provider. You can see the groups listed here that are authorized: physicians, nurse practitioners, certified nurse midwives, dentists, podiatrists, and physician's assistants that have an active delegation agreement with a certifying physician. This is the broadest amount of healthcare providers in the U.S. that are able to certify for medical cannabis. In most jurisdictions, you see either physicians only or physicians and nurse practitioners. In addition to patients themselves, there are also caregivers. These are individuals who are adults. In the case of minor patients, it is a parent or guardian who is able to go to the dispensary and obtain cannabis on behalf of the patient and then participates in the administration of cannabis to the patient. Qualifying conditions, those listed on bullet 1, glaucoma and PTSD, are what the commission has added via regulation. The initial statute adopted by the General Assembly is covered by bullets 2 and 3. So chronic or debilitating disease or condition that causes cachexia, anorexia, wasting syndrome, chronic or severe pain or seizures, or any other severe condition for which medical treatments have been ineffective and may reasonably be expected to be relieved by medical cannabis. So the General Assembly, in creating those conditions, really deferred to medical professionals in the state to determine whether medical cannabis would be appropriate for use by patients, taking MMCC out of the equation. Provider registration. So an individual who is a physician, nurse practitioner, et cetera, cannot just in and of themselves issue written certifications. They do have to register with the commission. It's a really simple process. We have APIs integrated with each of the licensing boards, so you provide your credentials, and it's automatic if your license is in good standing that you're able to register. But it allows us to keep track of those that are participating and then publicize that list of providers who are willing to certify, as it is a very small percentage of the overall healthcare provider population within the state. Across the different categories, it's about 1,500 individuals at present. The written certification itself can only be issued if a provider meets the following circumstances. The patient is registered with MMCC, so again, that's the first step. Second, the provider has a bona fide provider-patient relationship. 3, the patient meets the inclusion criteria of the provider and does not meet the exclusion criteria of the provider. So at registration, the certifying provider is going to tell the commission what conditions they're willing to certify for, and the patient has to meet one of those conditions. And lastly, the provider conducts an assessment of the patient's medical history and current medical condition. Limits on medical cannabis. Patients are limited in the amount that they can purchase and possess in a 30-day rolling period. That is 120 grams of flower, approximately 4 ounces, and 36 grams of THC in a 30-day period. For context, what General Assembly approved through House Bill 837 last year in terms of adult use limits is about a third of that. It's 1.5 ounces and 12 grams of THC for anyone over the age of 21. Next one. Okay, so testing and tracking. A common question that we receive is, what is the difference between what a patient is purchasing in a dispensary and what someone may be able to purchase on the street in the illicit market? And the two single greatest answers are the testing and tracking. So from a testing perspective, all medical cannabis products must pass laboratory testing prior to sale to any qualifying patient. Laboratory testing includes the following testing for safety and potency. So that's pesticides. In 2018, this body determined what crop protection agents may be applied to cannabis, and that list is very limited. Residual solvents, microbiological impurities, heavy metals. So it is rigorous testing, and again, all products must go through this. There is sampling and product testing performed by the independent labs. Those results have to be uploaded into our seed-to-sale system, and only those products that pass are able to move on in the distribution chain to the dispensaries. The last note here is, unlike alcohol and tobacco, cannabis remains federally illegal. That does impact the program in very significant ways. One of them is the absence of federal standards in terms of product standards and in terms of testing. Absent federal testing standards, The commission, Maryland, has worked with our colleagues across the country that also regulate cannabis, as well as the standards and testings organizations, to begin to standardize what tests are permissible and what needs to be tested for. So great strides have been made in this area since even the outset of our program in 2017, and continue to be made. You know, as we get more data, as more states come online, we're able to better improve what these tests should look like, what we should be looking for, and what are acceptable thresholds for certain contaminants. Seed to sale is something that was required in statute. The purpose of it is to ensure public health and safety and security of medical cannabis product. There was significant concern at the outset of the program that someone would be authorized to grow and that product would not be sold through a lawful dispensary to a medical patient, but through illicit means outside of the marketplace. So we went through an RFP process in 2016 with the help of Do It and contracted with Metric, is a seed to sale platform, and they're operational in about half of the states that have medical or adult use cannabis programs at this point. And all medical medical cannabis businesses in the state are required to track and report supply chain activities from cultivation, then to processing, and finally at the distribution level. And if you can go to the next slide, the benefits of that are pretty significant. First, from a public health perspective, when we had the EVALI crisis, which was broadly related to vapes in 2019, as CDC started gathering data, they identified vitamin E acetate as a problematic additive. Due to seed to sale software that we have within the state, when we were alerted to that, MMCC was able to put all vapes on hold with the click of a button until every product was tested for whether they had the presence of vitamin E acetate. Within 5 days, we were able to have the lab testing done on all of the products and determine that there was no vitamin E acetate in products that were available in Maryland, and they were able to be released. So it truly is a public health and safety mechanism. If we're talking about foodborne illnesses, now that there are edibles allowed in the state or other things, there can be immediate product recall and stopping of products being sold if there's a demonstrated harm. Program data. So just quickly looking at where things stand, we've gone over the structure of MMCC and the program itself. For patients, we have, what this should be reflecting is beginning in 2017 through to today in the beginning of 23. At the outset, there were about 10,000 patients that signed up in 2017 from April through December of that year. We're presently at 163,000. Again, this is individuals who are registered with us, the first step, and then also have an active certification that was issued by a certifying provider. So what this graph reflects is the program continues to grow from a medical patient perspective, but that level of growth is slowing. The next piece here is the retail sales. 2017, their sales began December 1st, so there's only 1 month of data. It was about $1.5 million in retail sales that first year. 2021 was the highest figure to date. That was about $565 million. For 22, there was a decrease, so it ended up only being about $510 million, so that's a 9 to 10% decrease in total retail sales. That was due almost exclusively to significant decreases in the median price of cannabis within the state. So again, the total retail sales declined by 10% from 21 to 22. Over that same time period, the median price per gram of cannabis declined by 24.5%, from $10.43 to $7.90. So there were more patients, there were more sales, but the cost of cannabis was significantly lower in 22 than it was in 21. This was not a Maryland issue. This is something that mature medical and adult use markets experience across the country, and 22 in particular was a hard year for the cannabis market. Oregon had declining sales of 16%, I think, and Colorado 10%. Even more recent markets like Michigan and Massachusetts that had gains still had massive drops in the price per gram. In Massachusetts, I think it was around 20%, in Michigan, closer to 40% in the cost per ounce. That's how they do it there. So it's something that as more operators come online, as there's more product in the market, the cost of that to patients and ultimately to consumers in an adult use market will decline. And so we see that. It's important to consider when you're thinking about tax rates that the return on investment there is going to decline over time if it's based on the total retail sales. And also that margins can become tougher for all levels of the supply chain as the market matures. Market share, what things look like within Maryland today. Again, I referenced that there's 22 growers, 28 processors, and 101 dispensaries. Who owns these businesses? We have many multi-state operators that are currently operating in the state. Those are legal cannabis businesses that operate in more than one jurisdiction. Many of them are now publicly traded on the Canadian Stock Exchange. So for growers, 10 out of the 22 licensed and pre-approved growers are MSOs, and 9 out of 22 are publicly traded companies. 6 out of 22 of the growers are owned by minority and/or women-owned firms, and 5 of those are specifically minority-owned. For processors, 13 out of 28 are MSOs, 10 out of 28 are publicly traded, and 11 out of 28 are women or minority-owned, and of those, 10 are minority-owned. Then for dispensaries, 36 out of 101 are associated with MSOs. And for the minority and women details, it's on the next bullet down. As of 2022, 39 out of 92 dispensaries that are operational and submitted the annual report are minority and/or women-owned. 19 of those are minority-owned. And there's this thought that the MSOs, through their number of businesses that are owned, a third of the market at the dispensary level, higher than that in grower and processor, take up a massive market share. But what I think for me the most interesting bullet on this slide is that of the 11 dispensaries that had sales in excess of 10 million in 22, 10 out of those 11 were independent. So what that demonstrates to me is businesses that are not vertically integrated, businesses that are small Maryland businesses are able to compete and are able to beat the large corporations when given the opportunity. And that compares to the median, so over 10 million there's only 11 that have over 10 million in sales. The median monthly gross revenue is less than $450,000. So that is significantly higher than a lot of the other businesses that they're competing with and against. Next slide. Okay, adult use legalization. As I referenced at the outset, you all are aware that the referendum itself had a companion bill in House Bill 837 that dealt with some of the criminal and public health issues related to legalization. It also had a lot of reports for MMCC. They're listed here. First, a comprehensive cannabis use baseline study that will be submitted by March of this year, going over the patterns of use, including frequency of use and dosing, methods of consumption, and general consumption among individuals under 18, so kids 18 to 21, 21 to 55, and individuals over 55, as well as pregnant and breastfeeding women. It has to look at incidents of impaired driving, hospitalizations, calls to poison control centers, and diagnoses of cannabis use disorder and problem cannabis use. So we worked with a lot of different state partners on that. We also did the largest and most comprehensive cannabis patient survey in the country, reaching more than 20,000 Maryland cannabis patients to understand the types of products they're using, how frequently they're using, the health outcomes related to that use. All of that information will be included within this baseline study, which again will be submitted to the General Assembly by March 1st of this year. In addition, we submitted a report on home cultivation. We were tasked with looking at home grow across the country, where it's allowed, what are the best practices, what has worked, what hasn't. So we provided a survey of state actions in that area and provided recommendations to this body on how to implement a home grow program specifically for medical cannabis patients. The House Bill 837 itself allowed adult use consumers to grow up to 2 plants within their home, but we were asked to look at whether things should be different for medical cannabis patients. On-site consumption, again, we were asked to look at best practices in adult use states and make recommendations to this body on how to safely implement on-site consumption or cannabis bars within the state. Youth use, specifically methods to reduce the use of cannabis by minors, including best practices regarding advertising, potency, packaging, labeling, and other methods to reduce the appeal of cannabis to minors. So the home cultivation, on-site consumption, and youth use were packaged into one report and were submitted to the General Assembly on November 1st. I think ultimately it was 160 pages in length. A lot of that is tables about what's going on in other states and best practices for your reference. It was about 45 pages of text and accompanied by a 7-page executive summary. Intoxicating hemp-derived products. This was something that was actually through a separate vehicle of legislation. There are THC, Delta-9 THC specifically, is what's commonly thought of as the only cannabinoid in the plant that can give off that high that's associated with cannabis. There are other intoxicating cannabinoids. There are other isomers and derivatives of Delta-9 THC, which, due to changes in federal law, are arguably legal in the state of Maryland. And so MMCC was tasked with reviewing these products, seeing what's available in the state, and making recommendations about whether and how to regulate those products moving forward. And then last, the joint report that Executive Director Kelly and Director Akris referenced earlier about MMCC personnel transitioning to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. That's the last couple slides are summarizing what we submitted jointly in that report. Quick level set of what we were asked to do. In uncodified language, it stated that if the referendum was ratified, it's the intent of the General Assembly that the office of the Executive Director of ATC shall be the successor to MMCC in matters concerning the regulation of cannabis. There was discussion earlier of, well, what about adult use? Our mandate was strictly related to the regulation of medical cannabis. That's what was in the statute. And so when we recommended that no additional resources were needed, that's because we were talking about the 2 areas that we presently regulate, not an additional large industry that would be forthcoming in the near future. And our mandate was specific to personnel. So we have, again, an MMCC part-time volunteer commissioners that are the decision makers, and underneath them, full-time staff that do enforcement, communications, IT, et cetera. And so how to transition those folks into ATC without losing any benefits or their jobs overall. And so we were also then tasked with minimizing the costs and putting together a transition in the most cost-efficient manner possible. So what did we do? Immediately after the bills were signed, we started getting together. Executive Director Kelly and I have known each other for a long time. I used to work with him at the Comptroller's office when I was supporting MDH's efforts on tobacco control measures across the state. And I think that our 2 executive teams really hit it off from the outset and have had an incredibly collaborative experience. And a good report came out of it, and I think we both are very excited about the future combination of our entities. What we looked at was existing personnel, existing office space, existing vehicles, existing operations. And we reviewed previous personnel transfers in the state, including the creation of ATC and movement of staff from Comptroller's office to the ATC. And we reviewed cannabis regulatory approaches in other states, focusing on those that had combined alcohol, tobacco, cannabis structures. The 5 major report recommendations, and again, we'll send this to the entire committee in full after, but that MMCC personnel will either transfer to a newly established Cannabis Regulatory and Enforcement Division within ATC, or merge into an existing shared administrative and operational functions. So what we identified was cannabis is pretty distinct from alcohol and tobacco in its setup, but we have a lot of shared services in HR, in procurement, and research, and we can probably combine those at the outset, whereas the regulation and enforcement of alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis may take a little longer to sort of blend those operations moving forward. 2, all MMCC personnel will transfer without any change or loss of pay, working conditions, benefits, rights, et cetera. Effective July 1st, ATC and MMCC will merge common administrative and operational functions. 4, ATC and MMCC will retain existing office space and study the need for additional office space and secure storage to accommodate organizational growth, particularly related to adult use cannabis. I can tell you, we, in the first meeting said, do you have any space? No. Do you have any space? No. We're both pretty maxed out within our existing spaces. So as we look to implement an adult use regulatory structure, office space and additional personnel are certainly 2 pieces that are needed. And then lastly, paper materials, so letterhead, et cetera, we have to use all of the ones that say MMCC before we can purchase anything that would share the new agency's name. And that's me, and I didn't put my phone number. I need to add that. I welcome any emails here, and I'll share my phone number with the committee as well for those calls. Madam Chair, any questions?
Thank you very much for that presentation. I don't see any. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. I appreciate it. A couple quick questions. With testing of the product, so at which level is the product tested? Is it at the grower or supplier, or?
It depends on the type of product that we're talking about. So if it is flower product, which is about 60% of the market, it would be before the grower can transfer the product to the dispensary for retail sale, it needs to pass testing. If it's a vape, tincture, salve, edible product, et cetera, something that's going from the grower to then the processor to be processed into something else and then go to the dispensary, it's at the processor level after the product is processed, manufactured in its final form, that it goes to testing.
Right, great. And at what level is the sampling done as far as with the requirement? Is it just like from a big batch, an ounce is taken out and sent to the lab, or how is that?
It's not an ounce, but an amount is taken from each batch, and I can follow up as to the exact sampling amount and what constitutes a batch. But the independent testing lab personnel come into the facility, and in the for flower product, it is separately stored, by batch, and so that lab personnel would go into that batch and take a representative sample of the product for testing. If we're talking about a processed product, they are going to take an edible, a vape, et cetera, and conduct the testing on those products, again, a representative sample of an overall batch.
Yeah. So would you say like a batch is like from the grower of a flower, everything from that crop in that field goes into a batch, and one sample is taken from that?
It's not that large where it would be an entire crop. So, for instance, if we were talking about flower product and there were a particular strain that the grower was growing that was in, that were all planted at the same time, going through the 16 to 20 week life cycle, we could be talking about 10 to 100 plants. Ultimately, that product is what is being sampled. So a representative sample of that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
And last question, you gave numbers as far as minority ownership and at various levels. Do you have a breakout as far as based on race, as far as African Americans or down the line?
I do for the growers and processors, and I can follow up on the dispensaries. So for growers, again, there are 22 authorized in statute, and of those, 4 are majority black-owned. And of the 28 processors, I think it's, well, is it, of those, 8. 8 of the 28 processors.
8 are what?
Are
Okay.
majority black-owned, sorry.
Okay, so do you have like for each other, all the other?
I can follow up with
subgroups
that,
of-
yes.
Yeah, I would just like to know
Sure.
exactly, for each one, what category they are of the minority status. Okay, great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hershey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Will, you had mentioned earlier about the limits on medical cannabis, and that patients are limited to a combination of 120 grams of flower or 36 grams of THC in a 30-day period. How is that monitored? Are dispensaries required to communicate with each other? Is there a database of some type?
The same, yes, there is. The same, the commission, the medical cannabis program are on Maryland One Stop. So a patient goes there to register initially, and beyond that, when, within their profile, they have at the start of a 30-day period, 120, 36 listed in there. And the dispensaries are required to use One Stop when dispensing cannabis, so that if they're dispensing a product, if it's flower product, it will reduce by the weight, as well as the THC amount equivalent there, and then if it were a vape product, by the THC amount. So it is through a formula, every sale reduces that amount. Most of the dispensaries don't love using One Stop, and so they have third-party POS systems that tie into it. So they're using a separate software that updates it, but it happens in real time. Maryland's initially was the only state, I think there's one additional one now, that has real-time changes in allotment. So if you were to go into a dispensary, immediately after that, your allotment is reduced. And if you were to go into another dispensary down the road, that's going to be reflected in the system that they're looking at.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the report that's due on March 1st. There's also, I guess, at the same time you're doing this, the House Legalization Work Group that has been hearing from a number of, I don't know if I've used the word experts, but certainly people that are very pro-legalization and marijuana of the industry. Are you let me ask, is your data, are you receiving information from a more broader group of advocates or people that are concerned about whether or not legalization has worked in a number of different states? As I said, the groups that we're hearing with just seem to be very pro-legalization, and I don't know if you heard the one group that we heard just maybe a few weeks ago came back and said that Maryland will be the biggest user of legalized marijuana of all the states combined, and we need over 300 not combined, but over 300 dispensaries within the state of Maryland, far more than Arizona, which is kind of what we had been comparing ourselves to with their population, and when they got on board, and they were very quick to say, don't compare yourself to Arizona. You're much better than that. You'll use a lot more than that. Are you listening to other groups besides groups like that?
Yes,
Okay.
is the short answer. But
Great.
specifically with the baseline survey, identified in the statute were who we needed to consult with. And that was the Department of Health, the Hospital Association, Poison Control. It is the entities that gather data in Maryland on poison control calls, on hospitalizations. It was working with the state police on drug driving incidents.
Right.
Because it is to see, in order to track the impact that adult use is going to have, we have to have a good sense of what the impacts are when it's an illegal market. And so that's the purpose of the baseline survey. I will say to the third-party presentation that you received, they did ask for and receive our aggregate data in terms of how much growers in the state are growing presently, and, square footage and understanding potentially their capabilities. So some of the projections came from data, hard data within our program, not getting to ultimately their conclusions, but we did provide them with information.
Right. Some of it might have came from that. Some of it came from surveying, I think is what they
Yes.
said as well, too. And they found that obviously there would be a lot of use here. The other, you mentioned that you were looking at on-site consumption, and you mentioned cannabis bars, but are you evaluating off-site consumption? Are you looking at other states and what they're dealing with as far as, are you able to walk down the street using marijuana? Are you able to stand next to a restaurant of outdoor seating? What are you looking at as far as those types of restrictions?
That was outside the purview of that particular report. It was specifically what states allow this and how do they structure cannabis bars if they do.
Strictly on-site. We didn't ask you to look at, the conversation that's been talked about a lot is are we going to treat this like smoking a cigarette outside, or are we going to treat it like drinking alcohol outside, right? You can drink inside the bar, but you can't walk outside with a beer can in your hand. Same time, you can walk out with a cigarette and you can smoke it outside. And so I think that's one of the things we were being tasked to how we're going to evaluate this. But we did not ask you to provide any input.
You did
on that.
not. I think in the course of research for all of those different reports and ones in the past, we do have some of that data as to whether there are criminal penalties or, civil fines associated with public
Or just
use of smoking.
restrictions.
Yeah,
Can-
and so,
can-
and
can
so
I-
I can look at what we have, and I'm
Right.
happy to share that.
Right. I mean, I'm concerned, especially after COVID, when we've asked a lot of restaurants or a lot of restaurants have taken that as the opportunity to expand outdoor seating and have made significant investment to do that. Are we going to, allow somebody to be, and I'll say smoking because I don't think anybody cares if they drop a gummy or something outside, but if they're going to be actually smoking that outside amongst a lot of people that, may not want to smell that. So I was wondering if you did that. And finally, just one other question. Again, we've been talking about tax structure. Other states, have they done this type of excise and sales tax as well, or how have they been taxing cannabis?
Every approach you can imagine.
Okay.
So it can be a simple sales tax, there can be an excise tax at the wholesale level, there can be both. More recently, there's been looking at reductions in overall sales. Should the tax be tied to retail sales, or should we be looking at different metrics? And so sort of tying public health in with the tax rate of associating with THC potency. So the higher the potency of a product, the greater the tax. So that's something New York is implementing with their new program. So any of the different tax structures you see for regulated age-restricted products like alcohol and tobacco have been tried in the cannabis space.
Okay. Again, does your report address?
We weren't
the-
asked to do that, but we've compiled it for you all before, and
We
I'm
didn't
happy
ask
to
you
share
to do
that.
much, did we?
We did, but it just,
Well, okay. Not that you didn't, but I would certainly like to have seen a few other things. But, all right, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Guile?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tilburg, I just, looking at this page on program update, quantity of patients, that one chart that you have here, I'm wondering if you could speak to the impact of adult use cannabis on this particular chart, on quantity of patients, or I guess the overall market, and what you foresee to happen with those trends.
that is a great question. So typically across states, you see a decline in the patient population over a series of years between 20 and 40%. So in total terms for Maryland, we would expect to see more than, 2-3 years out, still see more than 100,000 patients that are registered and certified, but that's certainly lower than the 162 we have now. There are different policy levers that the legislature can pull that may reduce that decrease. When you look at, is the medical product subject to taxation as the adult use product is? Are they able to access certain products that adult use consumers may not be able to because it's not appropriate for a recreational setting versus what would be more appropriate in a clinical setting? And then ensuring access for patients to products. And what I mean by that, and how it's different from the previous comment, is at the outset of sales, there tends to be a shortage and a lot of excitement and long lines. And so a state like Massachusetts that had 10 dispensaries at first had 2.5 to 3 hour long wait times at a dispensary. Patients that need that medicine, it's difficult for them. And so New Jersey, New York are examples of places where they've required dispensaries to set aside hours where it's patient-only access, continuing to have clinical or medical directors that can help patients to understand the use of cannabis, how it can be helping them, the types of products they may want to consider. So there's things the states can do to prioritize medical cannabis patients and the programs, but we would likely see a decline.
And that's likely because obtaining medical cannabis, the steps are a little bit more onerous than the adult use cannabis, correct? Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a two-step process of
Yeah.
registering and then the written certification. At the commission, we've tried to make the registration process as simple as possible. It is now, you submit, we have reduced fees down to $25, waived them for low-income individuals and veterans, and extended the registration period from 2 years to 6 years. So it's not something that you're constantly having to redo. And the thought behind that was, this is really a conversation between a patient and their provider, and it's one that we don't need to be involved in very often. And so reduce those administrative burdens as much as possible. We're hopeful that those additional regulatory steps will help keep people in the program that are truly using it for medicinal reasons.
And forgive me for not knowing this, but I assume medical cannabis is entirely out of pocket, correct? So health insurance, for example, doesn't cover medical cannabis, correct?
Correct. Due
Okay.
to the Schedule I status under federal law, insurers are not currently
Cannot.
covering.
Right, right. Okay, I believe those are all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Tilburg.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I have Vice Chair Klausmeier, Senator Lamb, and then Senator Kramer.
you, Mr. Till. It's not Till, that was it now. Tilburg, I missed the Berg there, but there are some patients that come from out of state, and are they allowed to get, for treatments, different treatments, and are they allowed to get a cannabis card or medical marijuana card?
The program currently is restricted to those who are living in Maryland or here for treatment in an inpatient capacity.
Okay, and is there any way that could expand at all?
Yes, there are several jurisdictions that allow individuals from other jurisdictions to access dispensaries within
So
their
I guess
state.
you would need legislation to make that happen?
Yes.
Or- Yeah, okay. And how do you think the commission would react to that? Are you-
It's a bill that's been introduced in the past,
Uh-huh.
and the commission was not opposed to the concept, but there were concerns about the specific vehicle that was introduced, and I can share the example. We talked about the registration process, the seed to sale, and the patient limits. So that's for Marylanders, those living in Maryland. The proposal that was previously introduced would have allowed anyone coming in from anywhere else to get an unlimited amount of cannabis, differentiating them from those living in the state and really disadvantaging Marylanders. And so we see states, Oklahoma is one, where you can apply to be a temporary patient within the jurisdiction. It lasts for 30 or 60 days. So that you're then within the seed to sale system, tracking the limits. I think the major concern overall for the commission was that not wanting to put those living in the state at a disadvantage compared to those in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I just, there have been several different, not organizations, but part of our state who have trouble keeping good qualified people. And you had mentioned that at the beginning, that you only have 31 out of 77 that are just regular employees of the state. Is there any way we can help you to fix that?
You sure can.
Okay.
You can help getting those pins. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of staff that really believe in this program and are helping folks, and it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to offer them the really full employment and all of its benefits.
Okay, so we would have to do something besides just getting the 100% specially funded license fees to help you out there, to put more into the budget?
So we have sufficient funding at present. Over the last several years, requests for merit positions that we can fund were denied. So we're hopeful that requests going forward may be approved.
Okay, who denies that? We?
We're part of the Department of Health, so that, they're the first step,
Okay.
and then the
All right.
Department of Budget and
All right,
Management.
we'll talk a little bit more. If I can help you out, well, I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We'll go to Senator Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question follows up on the Vice Chair's question, I guess, with regards to those FTEs. And it sounds as though you were limited by the number of pins that you have, I guess. 31 pins is all that you were allocated, and therefore, when you needed additional personnel, it sounds as though you really had to go out contractually to find additional personnel.
That's correct.
Okay. And the requests by MDH you had made those requests, they were turned down?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have the funding, would you have the funding to be able to support these additional folks in additional pins if you were granted the additional pins to be able to hire new people?
Yes.
You do? Okay. All right. My other question has to do with the written certifications, and I'm wondering if the commission tracks the number of written certifications that are provided by each provider. So, if there are providers that, for example, are prescribing, or it's not technically prescribing, but certifying a high number of patients, is that something the commission monitors, and may they follow up on?
We do have the capability. So when a provider is registering, from that point on, every certification they issue is listed within our system. So we are able to track that. It's something where I mentioned early in the slides that we don't have primacy over the certifying providers. There's very little we can do. We're dependent upon the different licensing boards. In communications meetings we've had, there's been expressed concern by the boards that they don't have established standards to refer to about what would be appropriate care. And so simply having a lot of certifications wouldn't be something sufficient for them to take action.
Got it. So even if there were a high number of certifications being provided by a provider, it doesn't sound as though that's referred to the boards. And even if it were, the boards would not know what to do with that information because they have nothing else to benchmark it against.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I mean, it's something where we had conversations pre-pandemic at this point, and I'm very happy to re-engage with the boards or to you in your office to see if anything's changed there, and we always are happy to provide data where it can be helpful.
Okay. I guess last question I had was with regards to, I heard that there was a bid notice that was put out the end of November, I think for an adult use consultant, where the bid notice had a very short turnaround time on when that RFP or applications for that RFP were provided. Is that normal procedure where there's such a short turnaround time on that, or is there anything you can shed light on that?
The turnaround times on our request for proposal range. For a large seed to sale contract, it can be 30 or 60 days. We have a lot of procurements that are currently in the process to help the state with the transition to adult use, and so we're moving things through on a very expedited timeline. So we have been, for a lot of them, narrowing the turnaround time so that we can make awards and get people working as quickly as possible.
Okay. And then I guess last question was to actually come full circle, follow up on the first part that I had. With the movement of the transition rather, of the commission into the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, will that make it easier possibly to be able to bring on additional pins to support the efforts that are ongoing currently with the commission that you need?
Yes, potentially. I mean, so my understanding with the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission is they work directly with DBM. We, again, as a unit within MDH, have an additional step. So it could streamline the process where we're able to speak to the ultimate agency making decisions directly.
So it would go initially to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission and then to DBM, I guess, for consideration for additional pins?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kramer, thanks for your
Thank you,
patience.
Madam Chair. You may have nothing to offer on this subject, or perhaps just because of your vast experience. I have been very concerned with regard to secondhand smoke exposure. And this is going, I guarantee every one of us sitting in this committee, once there is recreational cannabis, are going to start getting complaints from constituents who live in multi-unit dwellings about the exposure to folks who are in the apartment or the condo next door. And this is a particularly pungent product. You know, you can smell it for a block. I can always tell when there's a car ahead of me in traffic and somebody's smoking. And, you know, 3 cars later, I pull up next and there they are. You can see the cloud in the car. Are you aware of any jurisdictions, just from your experience, not maybe because you've looked into the issue, that have addressed the issue of secondhand exposure in multi-unit dwellings? Any jurisdictions that have required that it can't be, you know, I guess the flower or whatever it would be, that rather than smoke, that it had to be an edible if you reside in a multi-unit dwelling? Anything like that that you've come across?
This state currently has that in statute, and others do as well. But within our authorizing statutes in Health General, there is an authorization for landlords, homeowners associations, condominium associations to restrict or prohibit the smoking of cannabis if they adopt a policy. They cannot restrict other forms such as consumption by edibles. So that same provision could be applied simply to an adult use legal product. There are several states that have taken that step. It's not abnormal at all. I think working in this space for several years now, more broadly, there are a lot of these types of issues. If it's employment, if it's exposure to smoke, the drug driving, the more that the legislature can clarify things one way or the other expressly in statute, the better for the state. A lot of times, there's a focus on the commercial market and licenses and getting things up and running, and then the law is silent on whether, you know, you can still test for employment, whether you can hire and fire based on that, whether you are able to smoke in multi-unit housing or in public, and what the penalties are. The more you can clarify expressly, the better things are going to be. They'll help those that are, you know, commercial industry regulators as well as law enforcement understanding and the general public. But to your original question, yes, it's under current law. It could stay there, and other states have done it.
But that applies specifically to, for instance, if the board of a condominium association could make it smoke-free in statute. Is that correct, my
Yes.
understanding? But an individual for whom this is a nuisance, is there currently anything in place in statute that creates this as a nuisance?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I am aware of nuisance cases that have risen up in state courts after legalization. We can certainly follow up on whether there's any statutory provisions related to that have been.
That would be
adopted.
very helpful. I'd
Sure.
appreciate if you would. There was an article in the Washington Post this past weekend about a woman who lives in Washington DC, and she has had to file suit in court because the residual comes right into her home in a multi-unit dwelling, and she can't reside in her home anymore. And so she has filed suit in court, but I don't think we should be doing that to our residents, you know, forcing them to have to go through that kind of a process. So especially, there are a lot of elderly folks who reside in multi-unit dwellings, and I think this could be an issue. So, yeah, I would be very appreciative if you come up with
Absolutely.
anything that might be
Happy to
addressed.
share, yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I don't see any additional questions. I just have a few that I'm going to throw out very quickly. It's been a long afternoon. Committee's been very engaged, and thank you all for that. And most of my questions have been addressed. I just wanted to go to your point where you were talking about the supply cost and, talking about the trends in terms of the cost, even though usage increased, the cost of the product, I think you were saying, changed. I wanted to hear just what you think the impact of the commercial market would do to that element of your presentation. And then also was curious, and I don't know if we've tracked this at all, whether or not we've seen any impact in the illicit market since the implementation of medicinal cannabis. So I know those are kind of unrelated, but if you could address those, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Starting with the medicinal impact, it's not something that we have tracked to date. However, working with cannabis regulator colleagues across the country, I'm aware of work they have put in post-adult use legalization, coming back a year later and 2 years later to estimate the percentage of legal market capture that has occurred, and understanding that our medical market of 160,000 patients is significantly dwarfed by an adult use population of more than 4 million, and that's just in the state, let alone everyone outside. So I don't know that here or anywhere else there's been a study on the medical capture, but there is a growing body of evidence that depending on how quickly a program rolls out, the number of establishments, the amount of product, if it's able to meet demand, how quickly it can capture more and more of the illicit market. I'm happy to share some of the data that I'm familiar with on that, certainly.
No, I appreciate that. I know there were conversations before we implemented this initial program, both on, the arrest of certain populations and all of that stuff. And if we passed medicinal cannabis, that was going to save us. And so I know as we get to the next phase, I'd at least, if there are any lessons learned, for us to capture those as we look at this next phase.
In terms of arrests, they have decreased significantly. At the same time as the medical program was implemented, there also was decriminalization.
Right.
So it's tough to separate, which may have been, I think it's probably decrim, but there's not good data to separate those. Unfortunately, with those lower numbers, we're still seeing certain groups and communities disproportionately arrested. With those significantly lower figures, you do see, again, with legalization, another significant drop in the criminalization. I'm not aware of any race, gender, ethnicity data that exists, but if I encounter any, I'll certainly share it. And I'm
So
sorry.
basically, if I have you correct, sorry for interrupting, the numbers decrease, but the gaps still exist.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, thanks.
And then, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, your first question related to data.
You were talking about the.
The decrease is.
Right, the
And
price and trends and.
how an adult use market may impact that? Okay.
Correct.
So typically with an adult use market, because of the massive expansion in those who can access the product, there is an initial shortage. And it depends a lot on the structure the state puts in place about how long that shortage exists. But it can be 24 to 36 months where there are high prices. Very similar to our medical cannabis rollout where the prices in 2018, the median price per gram was almost double what it is today. There were less growers, they were less efficient at growing, there was less product, costs were higher. You see that again in a transition to adult use where there are so many more purchasers in these consumers that there is a shortage at the outset and high prices. And then over time, producers are able to expand capacity, more producers come online, and so there's more product in the marketplace, and the prices again come down. What's interesting, I was referencing several medical and adult use states, Colorado, Oregon. They have been legal adult use for almost a decade. Massachusetts and Michigan are the last couple of years. They also experienced significant decreases. So where they did have in Michigan and Massachusetts high retail prices at the outset of their adult use market, it did come down pretty quickly because of the number of manufacturers, cultivators, and retail outlets that they had in the state.
Thank you. So plain English, the appetite at the beginning of the program is that
Exceeds the
peop-
supply, and then it
Okay,
catches
and
up.
people are willing to pay more
Yes.
when the supply is low? Okay,
Yes.
got you. And then, yeah, I think that's all I'll ask for now. I did have a question, though, in the other states that you've looked at, so I'll go ahead and ask it. Do you know if there's any provisions in place that deal with, once people win license, do they keep them, or whether or not they're transferring license after they start down the road? And what are we doing? Or are all of these licensees that you listed in your breakdown that Senator Ellis asked about, are these the initial licensees that won those licenses? Are we transferring and selling licenses, I guess, is the question.
There are a lot of transfers. So the House Bill 2, which increased the amount of growers and processors authorized in the state and reconstituted the commission, also set a 3-year restriction on transferring ownership of any cannabis license until the business had been operational for 3 years. So we licensed businesses first in 2017, 2018. So beginning in 20 and 21, there was a lot of turnover of businesses. So when you're looking at this slide, in 10 out of 22 licensee or pre-approved growers or MSOs, that's not how it started. They've come in and purchased. So there has been significant turnover in the market, somewhere 40%, maybe a little higher of the licenses have turned over in the lifetime of the market. And, due to IRS restrictions and lack of banking, a lot of the independent, particularly dispensaries, were hit financially hard when tax time came around. And so we did see that a lot of the smaller operators sold to the larger businesses just so they could, turn a profit from their business because it was so difficult to do so.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions from the committee? All right, that concludes our hearing. Thank you so much for your testimony, and meeting adjourned.